Hey, good evening. My name is Brett Long, and tonight I'm going to be going over the evolution of baseball media coverage and how that has expanded over the last couple hundred years, to be honest, since the first game back in 1846. So I want to get started off with kind of the initial piece that really kind of started it all, and that was the newspaper. And as one of my references here from also my piece was that newspapers really covered baseball like a blanket. They were all encapsulating. Most of the teams were located up in the northeast side of the country, a lot of them in New York. And with that, many of the local newspapers in New York really kind of reported and covered all the local baseball teams up there. So it was easy for, New Yorkers or, people in Massachusetts, Vermont, Rhode Island to really get involved in the nitty gritty of what was going on in the baseball world, even though it was, very early on. Again, first game in 1946, but the more baseball games there were, the more newspapers that were really sold because people were so intrigued and wanting to understand, okay, who's doing what and how is this continuing to, grow in our, great nation. Again, this was a very, very early stages. Again, the newspaper was the only initial piece to start off, and the New York Mercury really coined the phrase as calling baseball the nation's pastime back in 1857, and that's kind of translated now to America's pastime, and that's what we know baseball as. As we continue to go on, we see the evolution of technology to continue to grow, and that really the next step was onto radio. And the inception of commercialized radio began in Detroit, Michigan in 1920, and baseball took on its first radio broadcast in Pittsburgh a year later in 1921 with the KDKA team. Later on, the World Series was broadcast in 1922. There was 2 games that were broadcast, and as many as 5 million people were listened into those 2 games, and that was really considered one of the greatest audiences ever assembled to listen to one man, and that was Grantland Rice back at that time. Grantland was definitely a lot more stoic. Later on, you see some more characters get brought onto the radio scene that might be a little more eccentric. Former actors, singers who have a little bit more flair for understanding the situations and kind of encapsulating how things really are with some emotion involved. And as radio continued to grow, baseball owners really began to get a little bit concerned with the great success that they were having. And with that, they were worried that, that would hinder people from coming into, the stadiums to watch those games, which is kind of crazy to think, with the growth of radio, you're kind of expanding, who your audience is and, the people that are really connecting with you and your team and its players. But owners didn't really see it that way. They saw that it was potentially taking away from their revenue that they were generating at the stadiums, probably along with concessions, obviously ticket sales, and just bringing foot traffic into the stadium. So that was a major concern for owners. Obviously, eventually, all owners kind of gave way into that, and everyone, all the teams began being broadcasted over the radio. And then the next step really we see, is into cable television. Initially there is the main televised pieces of just having game of the week. Back in the first one was in 1953. Dizzy Dean was heading the microphone on that game, and as we continue to grow, we get into cable television later on in the late 70s. And that was also when we saw that ESPN was launched, and that really kind of changed the way that the sports world was viewed. As television really helped grow the game of baseball, you can see continual growth of things like transportation, better roads, better cars, and also public transportation allowed for fan bases to grow their audience, but it also allowed for the everyday fan to really connect with certain players and that they might not have been able to see before. on a daily basis, or listening to on the radio. It's harder to put a face to a name, or really be able to connect as a young player with someone who you might look a lot like. You might feel that more personal connection there. So that's when you see kind of fan bases expanding all over the country. You can see I added in a picture of Harry Carey here. WGN being one of the bigger broadcasting networks in Chicago at the time, and Harry Carey being the voice and also the image of the Chicago Cubs for a long time. The late great, he surely was 101 type of character. And all of these pieces are all continual with each other. It's all history, it's all in the past, but it doesn't go away. We still use all those outlets every single day as a sports fan. I noted in my piece that picking up a newspaper every now and then and going through the sports section to get a different perspective on how people might be viewing things in the sports world is sometimes kind of refreshing. And being able to turn on the radio in the car and listen to your local team's game, or turning on ESPN radio and seeing what the Sunday night baseball game might look like, or the Wednesday night baseball game might look like, and getting to paint that picture in your head, right? Those are things that don't go away. But nowadays, it's so easy for us to dive onto the internet or dive into our streaming platforms. There's so many different opportunities for baseball to be consumed nowadays, which I think is great for the game. I think it's also hard because things aren't centralized. There's Apple TV Friday Night Baseball. There's ESPN Plus, where you can watch any kind of baseball game. There's the MLB TV app, where if you subscribe, you can dive completely into all baseball games except for your own local team, because you'll get blacked out. So then you'll have to watch on cable TV. And as baseball fans, the internet really allows us to easily access, box scores from games which you might miss, and partially kind of dissolving the need for something like a newspaper. I would say, again, it is kind of refreshing, and you see some older folks always diving in, and having that kind of habitual feeling there as well. But it gives you a different perspective in how you can kind of explore from time to time with the different platforms and how you can utilize that. So that's kind of a brief overview of the evolution of baseball in media, and I appreciate your time. Thanks.